Church, let's go ahead and get started this morning. If you will, turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. We'll pick up from there here in a moment. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Before we get into our study this morning, let's go through our prayer list. Let's remember Sue Gentry as she continues to recover from her recent knee surgery. It went well. She's at home, and I think she started physical therapy on Friday, and they were getting her started on that pretty quick. So let's remember her as she goes through that PT. Let's remember Twillia Stewart and the passing of her brother. I believe she may still be out of town. I think the funeral was on Thursday, so let's remember her and the rest of that family, and especially as she travels back home. Chris Bridges is in town. She came in town for a surgery, and so she is at home, or she is staying with Cindy and Mark, and she is recuperating. I believe she's staying with Cindy and Mark. Am I right in saying that? Yeah, okay. I thought so. Cindy Pack continues to recover from her break of her foot and still in considerable pain. Please, if you can, reach out to her, encourage her, and let's keep her in our prayers. Karen Harvey, I believe that's her cousin, started chemo this week, and it started to go well. Stephanie Jones, which I believe is Cindy's sister, is still working with her medical team to determine what the best path forward is. Candy Bailey continues her cancer battle. I think that's Lita's niece. So let's remember that family. And then Charles Hood, he responded to the invitation last Sunday. He's been battling blood cancer. I don't know how long he's been battling it, but as he said last week, it's not life-threatening, but it is life-altering. And so he's not able to do a lot of the things that he used to be able to do. And that's not just being active, but that's also in taking care of other people. So let's be mindful of him and reach out and see if there's a way that you can help him in some way. Was told a few moments ago, Bo, about a year ago, right, had fallen and hurt his elbow, and it's been in bad shape for about a year, and so they just had surgery. He just had surgery this week, Tuesday, is that what you said? On Tuesday, to remove a little bit of the bone and also his bursa sac, and the hope is that this works. So let's be prayerful that this does work and that he is free of pain. Anybody else that we need to be mindful of? On Wednesday, okay. All right. Let's remember our sister Pat and her upcoming surgery on Wednesday. Anybody else? All right, Cliff, if you don't mind.
Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this time together where we can learn about you and to hear your words and find out your heart and your meaning for our lives. Father, please be with Chase as he brings us this lesson. Please open our hearts to your message. Father, please be with all those who are not well in this fallen world. We know that illness is a part of life, and please be with those who aren't well and help them to get better, and please bring your healing hand on them and help them to recover from their illness. Please be with the doctors and guide them as they minister to people who are not well. I ask you to please be with us today, and Father, please help us to understand your words. I ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, again, we are in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Paul in chapter 10 has started to go down a different road concerning these Corinthians. He's already kind of focused on that major group, the group that has repented, the group that has done better, and he has commended them for that, and that was mostly chapters 1 through 7. And then now he's talking to that smaller group, that minority group that is there within Corinth, that still, I guess part of this report from Titus is that they're still kind of listening to those false teachers who have come in. And so he is in the middle of boasting, right? And man, boasting is a difficult word, isn't it? It's hard to say boasting in a positive way because we have very much turned boasting into bragging. But the word boasting literally means glory in. And so he is glorying in something. So, and what we focused on last week, chapter 10, verses 12 through 18, Paul is preparing them for his boasting. So kind of the preface before he gets into the meat of his argument. And he says he's not going to boast the way that those false teachers do. How do the false teachers boast? In themselves, right? In appearances. They commend themselves. How is Paul going to boast? In God, right? And he makes that clear. Anything that I talk about is going to be what I've participated in, the work that I've done, but this is all in God. And he makes that very clear as he prefaces chapter 11. And so in chapter 11, he's still kind of preparing that boast, asking them to bear with him in a little foolishness in verses 1 through 3. Why is it that he's going into this foolishness? Why is he going into the argument or the method of this argument of using boasting? I think we get our answer in verse 2. Why is he going into this boasting? Why does he want them to bear with him in a little foolishness? Because he is jealous for them with a godly jealousy, because they are supposed to be the church, but they are acting as adulteresses by following after another gospel. And so he says, I'm going to go into this method because it is good for you. I'm going through this method, and not a single time is he sinning in this. A lot of times we want to tie boasting to sinning, and what he's doing is very much boasting in God. But what he's clarifying here, what we talked about last week, we looked at that proverb, I believe it was in Proverbs 26, answer a fool according to his folly, which means what? What did you say last week, Shannon? To answer a fool according to his folly. That's all right. That's all right. I put you on the spot. It means he's basically coming down to their level, right? So not an ounce of this is him actually boasting in himself, but since they listen to fools, he's like, all right, maybe that's the language I need to speak to you in. And so he comes down with the full intention to come back up, because he's got to drag them out of that spot. And the comparison I made last week was to someone being in a hole. Most of the Corinthians got out of that hole on their own. But there were still some of them that were down there in the muck and the dirt, and they were still filthy. And so Paul is essentially coming down to pick them up and boost them out of there. And so that's his focus here as we get into chapter 11. Let's pick up in verse 3. I don't remember if we covered this question last week or not. What is it that Paul is afraid of according to verse 3? His fear is that they've been led astray, that they are chasing after something that is not true. And the comparison is to the impurity of Eve after being deceived by the serpent. So in this regard, the Corinthians, or at least this group of Corinthians, are being compared to Eve, and the false teachers are being compared to that serpent. He's afraid that they're being led into spiritual adultery by this false teaching. Looking at verse 4, what is his evidence for this accusation? Verse 4 can almost read like a hypothetical, but it's not a hypothetical. He's laying out what is actually happening there. What is his evidence for this accusation? Right. There are people that are coming in, preaching a different Jesus, a different spirit, a different gospel than what Paul had brought to them. Someone is bringing different fortresses, building up different fortresses. Remember the word fortresses from chapter 10, verse 4? That someone is bringing in these other fortresses and building them up. And what are these Corinthians doing about it? They're questioning them, right? Is that what they're doing? When these people are building up these fortresses and these false teachings, the Corinthians are checking every single thing that they say and casting them out whenever they're teaching a false teaching. That's what the Corinthians are doing. They're bearing it beautifully. He says, if someone comes in here and teaches you something different than what I taught you, you bear this beautifully. Now, take this and compare it to what he said in verse 1. He said, bear with me in a little foolishness, because I already know that's what you bear with. Here's my evidence. Someone else has brought in a different gospel, and you bear with that beautifully. So if you're going to listen to that, please at least hear what I have to say as I come down to this level. Look at verse 5. Who is Paul not inferior to? The chief apostles. All right, so what version are you using? I'm curious. King James, okay. This is very tricky here. So when he says he's not inferior to the chief apostles, or the New American Standard says the most eminent apostles, who is he referring to? I'm sorry? Super apostles. So that's one interpretation, is that maybe he's referring to Peter and John, right? Because at this point, James is gone. And so it could be that Paul is very much saying here, I am not inferior to Peter and John. If that is what he is saying, how does that fit into this context? How do we understand this if this is a reference to Peter and John?
That's his bona fides, maybe?
Don't look at me as less than Peter and John. That's what it would have to mean if the most eminent apostles or the chief apostles are him referring to Peter and John, right? But look at the very next passage. Look at verse 6. In bringing up this subject of these most eminent apostles, he says that he has what? He has knowledge. So he's not at all referring to these most eminent apostles. Peter and John is not having knowledge. It can't be. That would make no sense whatsoever, because Peter and John have knowledge. They, just like him, have this knowledge. Who has the New Living Translation? Can you read that?
I don't have the New Living Translation, but I have the Amplified version, and it has in parentheses after these extra super, it says false. So this is Paul being sarcastic about the false apostles.
I think that is the correct rendering here. The NIV, ESV, and the New English translation call them super or superior apostles. The New Living Translation adds on a little bit of a commentary. I'm not a big fan of adding on commentary to translations, but I think their commentary is correct. These super apostles who teach such things. So he's kind of saying it sarcastically. He's using this phrase, superior apostles, that's exactly right, referring to these false teachers. And so he's in essence saying what? For I consider myself not in the least inferior to these most eminent apostles, because you're bearing with them. Why don't you bear with me? I'm not inferior to these people. That's the whole core of his argument here.
Chase?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Weren't apostles supposed to be witnesses to the crucifixion and resurrection?
Yes. Well, yes. So they had to see Jesus, right?
And these people, after seeing Jesus, talk blasphemy?
They're teaching a whole lot of things. Yeah. I mean, consider what we studied in chapter 3. What was it that these false teachers were bringing? You need to follow the Old Testament, basically, is what they're teaching, because they're Judaizing teachers. And they're completely missing Jesus Christ in it, right? That was his whole argument in chapter 3. And so he's saying here that he is not inferior to these super apostles. This is I believe it was Kaufman that said this, a term of derogation applied sarcastically by Paul to these false teachers. You bear with them, but I'm not inferior to them. What would have seemingly made him inferior to them in verse 6? Untrained in speech, which this may be him somewhat quoting what they have said. You don't want to listen to Paul. He's not skilled in speech. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, what has Paul brought to the Corinthians? What has Paul taught to the Corinthians? The gospel. I preach to you Jesus Christ and him crucified. He has brought to them the gospel. They know this. They know what he has taught. And this seems to be them pointing at him and saying, you don't need to listen to Paul. He's unskilled in speech. It does not mean that he is actually deficient in this area, but simply something that may have been raised against him. What keeps him from being inferior to them? Knowledge, right? This is how we know that the superior apostles or most eminent apostles or chief apostles cannot be referring to the actual apostles. Because verse 6 is a comparison between himself and the so-called super apostles. I may be so-called unskilled in speech, but I am not so in knowledge. And he's referring, of course, to that knowledge of God, which in chapter 10, verse 5, is what these false teachers are building up their fortresses against. Paul brought the Jesus. He brought the Spirit. He brought the gospel, all by the knowledge of God. Therefore, he is not inferior to them because he has the knowledge that they do not have. In every way, we have made this evident to you in all things. Now, look back at chapter 10, verse 7. And what does he say in chapter 10, verse 7? At the very beginning, what's that first sentence? Right, and remember when we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, it's likely the more accurate rendering of that is what the ESV has. Look at what's before your eyes. Look at what's in front of you. Here, he's essentially repeating that. In every way, we have made this evident to you in all things. Talk about, look at what's in front of you. You have seen me. You have seen what I've done. You have heard from my lips the gospel. But you're listening to them? Bear with me in a little foolishness, because that's what you're bearing with these people. And this is Paul prefacing, continuing this preface as he goes into the meat, especially in verse 7. So what is Paul's concern in verse 7? So he's explaining why he's going into this boasting. And then he says, even if I looked at the wrong one. Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted because I preach the gospel of God to you without charge? Did I sin by not charging you for bringing the gospel to you? Now this.
So he's saying they would feel that they got what they paid for?
Say again.
Is he saying maybe they felt they got what they paid for?
What he may be saying here is, this is where Paul is kind of getting to the bottom of the issue, right? You look at what's before your eyes, right, as he said in chapter 10, and then here he's saying, I'm not inferior to them, so what is it? Is it that I sinned because I didn't take money from you? This might be his imagination. This might be him providing an option. Like, could this possibly be it? It may be an accusation that has been brought against him. Well, Paul's not really an apostle. He doesn't even take money. He has a privilege to take that money, and he's not taking money from you. It could very well be their play into trying to get him to take money, as we will see as we go further in this. So why would Paul consider it a possibility that they think that he has not sinned by taking money? In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 4 through 15, he goes through the discussion of how he has the right to say, you need to pay me for this, but he doesn't use that right. And so these Corinthians and these false teachers might have taken this refusal as, well, he's refusing this legitimate privilege. Maybe he's hiding something, or they're putting this bug in the ears of the Corinthians. Maybe that he is not truly the apostle that you want him to be. Why is it that he refused this payment? In verse 7. Look at verse 7. Humbling himself and exalting them, right? Did I sin by exalting you, by not taking any of your money? He humbled himself that they might be exalted. He's taking no riches, and he's giving them all of the riches. Paul is providing for them the truth of eternal life and taking nothing in return from them so that they might be raised up. Was this a sin, he asks? Is this what is separating us, that I chose to exalt you over myself by giving you the knowledge of eternal life? Is that why you listen to them and you don't want to bear with me? Look at verses 8 and 9. How was Paul able to preach the gospel to the Corinthians for free? It's certainly hyperbole, right? But he's detailing that he took funds from other congregations. And we know Macedonia supported him. We know that whenever he was out, those in Philippi and those in Thessalonica would send him goodies, would send him gifts, would help support him while he is gone. That way, he doesn't have to take anything from these Corinthians. What's interesting is when you look back at chapters 8 and 9, remember he's talking about the gift that is going to Jerusalem. He brings up the Macedonians as an example. Now, Corinth was a pretty wealthy place, and some of these Christians might have actually had a little bit of money. But he's not asking for their money, even though he's in such a wealthy place. Rather, the Macedonians, which are a little bit poorer, who are giving beyond their ability, are supporting him. And so he calls this robbing. He says, I've taken from them so that I can give to you. Paul did not want to be a burden on anyone in Corinth, and he would not be a burden. He would continue to not be a burden. He would still not take money from them. Such an accusation or imagination of his would not get him on the payroll of the Corinthians. He's not asking this and saying, all right, well, the solution then must be for me to take your money. He's saying, I'm still not going to take your money. Did I sin by not taking your money? I'm still not going to do it. This shows his integrity. The next three questions are going to be somewhat synonymous, I guess, in nature. But I wanted them to be separate because of the succession that we see. So we see basically one answer to this question in verse 10, one answer in verse 11, and one answer in verse 12. So I worded them to go primarily with each of these verses. So Paul will continue to do so, which means he will continue to not take their money. Why? Why, according to verse 10, will Paul continue not taking money from the Corinthians? Well, look at what he says. As the truth of Christ is in me, what? From boasting, right? He's saying, as the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be stopped in the regions of Achaia. That is Corinth. What boasting does Paul have in Corinth? What is he able to boast about? You might put your thinking caps back on to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, specifically verses 16 through 18. What was he able to boast in Corinth? For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for I'm under compulsion. For woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward, but if against my will, I have a stewardship entrusted to me. He has to preach. Remember that when we studied that? He has to preach. I am a volunteer. I am thankful that you allow me to work this job full time by what you give. He is not a volunteer. He is being made by God to provide the word. And if he doesn't do it, it is a sin. So what is his reward? What would be Paul's reward? Look at verse 18. That when I preach the gospel, I may offer the gospel without charge so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. So what's Paul's reward? What is so rewarding and fulfilling for Paul? That he can do this for free. That rewards him. That boasts him. That makes him feel good. So why is it that he's, whether this is an imagination or an accusation that is brought against him in verse 7, regardless of what it is, why will he continue to not take their money? Because this is something that he can do and glory in. I am thankful, Paul says, that I don't have to take your money, and I can just bring you God. And that's what he's able to boast in. Verse 11, a similar question. Looking specifically at verse 11, why is he refusing support from them? Is it because he doesn't love them? It's because he does love them. So he says, I'm rejecting your gift because I am able to do this without taking money from you. I'm rejecting your gift because I love you, because I want you to hear this. It's not because I don't love you. It's very much because I do love you. Why would he assume it's because he doesn't love them? Why would he bring that up as an option? Is it because I don't love you? Is it just that he cares that much about boasting? Yes.
Is it just another unfavorable comparison to the false apostles that they're supposedly learning under?
I think so. And essentially, they may be saying, well, he's just doing this because he just wants to hold this over your head. Well, he's just doing this because he wants to prove to you that he's just better than us. Is our money no good to you? He's telling them, I'm not taking your money, not because I just love to boast, but because I love you. Now, look at verse 12. Why will Paul continue to preach to them free of charge? I told you these three questions are very synonymous, but he gives three different points here. Why will he continue to preach to them free of charge? That he may do what with that opportunity? He's going to cut off opportunity for who? Those false teachers who desire an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in the matter about which they are boasting. Basically, he's going to continue to preach to them free of charge, not taking their money. Why?
Undercut the competition.
I'm not going to give them any reason to say that we are the same. They already call themselves apostles. These most eminent apostles. Remember, he started with a base argument in chapter 10. I believe it was in verse 7, maybe verse 8. And he says, if they are Christ's, so also are we. Here's my base argument. Let's all start from the bottom. I'm a Christian. And then Paul goes on to talking about his authority. And now Paul is saying, they're taking your money. I'm not going to take your money. And the reason I'm not going to take your money is because I'm going to prove to you how different we are from them. They are boasting about equality with Paul as apostles, essentially saying, listen to us, we are apostles too. If Paul accepts their money, they have the easiest avenue to say, look, told you, we're apostles. It either brings him down to their level or it ascends them to his level. And so Paul has just explained to them three reasons why he will still not take their money, even if this is a true accusation against him. I'm not going to take your money because I'm not giving them an opportunity, because I love you, and because this is my reward. He doesn't have reward just in preaching the gospel. He has to do it. He has to preach the gospel. That is what God has instilled in him to do in Acts chapter 9. You are going to suffer for my sake, God said to him. He has been called into this specifically as an apostle. He has no reward just by preaching. But man, it must feel good for him to be able to go somewhere and preach without having to take any money. He's explaining the differences, and even with these differences, he is not going to falter, and he is not going to change his course and start taking money from them, even though he has a right to do it. What does that say about Paul and his feelings toward these Corinthians? Boy, does he love them. That he would be so willing to do without so that they might have something, so that they may be able to do with. He is so willing to go without just so that they see how corrupt these false teachers actually are. Now, why doesn't he, in verse 13, want to be regarded as equals with them? They're what? Deceitful what? Deceitful workers, right? What does he call them right before this? I don't know if it's the same in your translation. He called them superior apostles a while ago, and now he's fully coming out and saying false apostles. He's not going to be regarded as equals with them. In chapter 10, verse 12, he said, going into this argument, but I want you to understand, I'm not going to use the same argument they use, because we have a different standard of measurement. They compare themselves with themselves. I'm going to show you what God has done. He calls them out very much for what they are here. He is not going to be regarded as equals with them because they are false apostles. He will not be put into the same group as them. And if that means that he does without, then Paul is willing to do without. These people are nothing more than deceivers. Who does he compare them to in verse 14? Satan. Why? Because even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. These false teachers, they're disguising themselves as apostles. Well, they're false. They're deceivers, and they are no better than Satan. Verse 15, what does Paul call them? Right, he's essentially calling them the servants of Satan, because they're disguising themselves as righteous when they are unrighteous. Elsewhere, this is called what? Wolves in sheep's clothing, right? Since they are Satan's servants, they cannot be called Christians. And what will their end be? Verse 15, what will their end be? According to their works, according to their deeds. What are their deeds? Being false apostles, teaching what is not the gospel. They are pretending to be something that they are not. That sounds oddly familiar, doesn't it? That sounds very similar to when Jesus is walking into Jerusalem, and before he gets there, what does he see? He sees the fig tree. And he does what to that fig tree? Why? It's pretending to be something that it's not. It's claiming to be in bloom, but it is not. And that's when he goes in and he sees the temple for what's going on. He sees that there are these people that are desecrating the temple, and he flips the tables over. Because these people are claiming to be something that they are not. We have echoes of that here. Paul is calling these people phonies. Put this together with what we studied in chapter 10, verses 4 through 6, where they build fortresses against the knowledge of God. Anyone who does not preach the truth, but preaches against the knowledge of God, will be paid by God for such teachings. Further, we have the apostles' teaching, these men that are inspired by God. If someone's teaching is not in line with the apostles, then they are deceivers, and he calls them servants of Satan. As we put all of this together, consider what he is saying in verses 1 through 6. Paul asked them to bear with him in a little foolishness. Why? Because he's about to boast. He's about to go into their argument. And what is it that Paul boasts about in verses 7 through 11? He did, right? And how does he boast in verses 7 through 11? What is it that he boasts about? Specifically. God, but being able to take the money, or being able to preach the gospel without taking money. Why does he boast? Verses 12 through 15. What is the whole point of his boasting? To show the difference between him and them. It's sometimes, if we only study this at a surface level, we can completely misunderstand what Paul means by boasting. Paul is not at any time, talking about how great he is. Paul is not boasting or sinning in any way. What he is doing is he is basically getting them out of that muck. He says, all right, I'm coming down to get you, but I'm going to make sure we both get up and we're out of this hole and we're on the other side. Not at once does he actually lower himself to be like them. He prefaces all of this by saying, I'm not going to group myself with them and do what they do. And he doesn't. The whole point of Paul doing any of this is that he is showing them how he is different from them. Any comments or questions before we move on to verses 16 through 33? I'll go Tony first.
How can we compare it to current times? What do we see? Can we compare it to, and I hate to say the televangelists, can we compare it to denominational churches? Can we compare it to challenges that we face today? Politics, religion, a life where I'm here for you. Just write this check and everything will be great. Can we compare it to, I'm bringing a message but at a fee? You know, you see these health advertisements on the internet, and when you go on there, it's about this long, and you don't even know how much the health benefit costs until you want to buy it.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting.
Right.
I always look at this, what Paul's bringing to us, as things haven't changed. False teachers are here. They're even better at it than then, because they got, better at
They've got some experience now.
better medium.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I think where we can ultimately relate to Paul here is when we study with somebody, when we're talking with somebody. Because false teachings are very prevalent in this world, right? We have family members and friends who are listening to that stuff. How would Paul respond to them? He would respond in truth, but what is Paul doing? He's having to come down a little bit. He has to meet them on their level. Sometimes the reason I think that we fail in our evangelism to those that we care about is because we are speaking away from each other. If we keep saying the same thing, it's not going to suddenly make sense to them. We have to be like Paul and say, all right, let's start from this base argument and let's study outward. Let's understand it from its most base concept. All right, you had something.
I agree with Tony. He pretty much said what I was going to say. It almost seemed like he could, Paul could say instead of bear with my foolishness, it's like he could almost be saying, bear with me being a politician.
Sure.
I'm going to have to, show you why I am
Right.
doing what I'm doing, just having to be a politician.
I'm going to sound like them, but I'm not being like them, right?
Yes, verse 15, it says, their end will correspond to their deeds. What was their deeds that was evidence to them during that period?
So these false teachers, their deeds would have been that probably more detailed in what he said in chapter 3, where they are still bringing of it, basically the law of Moses. And so he details there that they still have the veil. Christ removes the veil, but they are still referring to that stuff. We have the Judaizing teachers referred to in Galatians and Acts 15, where they are still saying, well, Christ is the Son of God, but you still need to be circumcised. And Paul says basically in chapter 3, that's not right. And so they keep teaching this, and they're teaching essentially other things that are going against the knowledge of God, as he details in chapter 10. So these deeds are very much their false teachings and passing themselves off as being apostles. It seems that these people are, to some degree, being very purposeful in this. if they're calling themselves apostles, I think he uses that term, most eminent apostles, basically because they're trying to pass off as apostles. And that's conjecture, but that seems to be the indication here, is that if he's going to use that sarcastically and call them false apostles, I think they're trying to pass themselves off as apostles. And if you're pretending to be something that you're not, your end will be according to your deeds, right?
It's not like they have Google and they can look up photographs.
Say again?
It's not as if they had Google and could look up photographs. They took them at their word.
Right.
As they were apostles.
Well, I mean, consider at the beginning of chapter 3, are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Because we're only talking about us and the gospel. These people were bringing in letters of recommendation. They're sounding good. They bring a whole resume. Hey, Corinthians, you need to listen to us because, well, we're Hebrews. Well, we are of Abraham. Well, we come from this long line of God's people. And that's basically what they have said, as we will see in verses 16 through 33. We have 4 minutes left, and we have 17 verses to read. I think what we're going to do is call class just a few minutes. I take a lot of your time after the so-called bell, so I will give you 4 minutes back this week. And I encourage you to go home and read verses 16 through 33. All right, thank you all so much.